we have Professor Steve Benford in the house from Nottingham University, and Steve is somebody that has had an awful lot to do with the enjoyment of using technology, but he's going to be talking actually about uncomfortable interactions. So.
Did you think I was number one? Sorry. Hello?
Two.
Number two? Oh, that sounds good.
Sorry.
That's okay, no problem. Yes, thank you very much for asking me to come and talk. Yes, I'm going to talk about some research work. So I direct the Mixed Reality Lab at the University of Nottingham, where we're interested in how people interact with physical and digital stuff when it gets mixed up. Although I'm also currently a visiting professor at the BBC at the moment at Media City, although I must say, given the content of what I'm about to say, this is my lab work, not my BBC work, and I'm sure they would rather rush to disown some of it fairly quickly, so that's not BBC talk. So, as computers get used increasingly for entertainment and cultural experiences and artistic experiences, and as we saw from the last talk, spread more and more away from the kind of traditional world of kind of white-collar office work. So the notion of usability and the principles and goals that it embodies change. Usability used to be, well, what was it about? Ooh, speed to learn and reducing the number of errors that people make and increasing their performance and stuff like that. But what we're finding as we look at more artistic and creative uses of computers is that the game changes. You have to think about different kinds of values you're designing for and different approaches to how you design for them. In my talk I want to give you one such example, and I'll admit up front it's a bit of an outlier to get you thinking. I want to talk about the benefits of deliberately seeking to make your users uncomfortable, why you might want to do it, if you do, how you can set about doing it. I'll give you a bit of a cookbook, if you like. But then there'll be some words of warning about how you need to embed discomfort within the overall journey of an experience, and also, if we don't run out of time, a little word about ethics as well. So first up, why might you want to make people uncomfortable in the first place? And I'm going to make an argument that there are three broad reasons why you want to think about doing this. The first is intensifying their entertainment. So a number of experiences that we enjoy involve discomfort. A roller coaster ride involves often an amount at certain points of physical discomfort. High G-forces, loops, inversions and suspensions are all part of the experience. Of course, it also involves another kind of discomfort in terms of suspense and anticipation of what's going to happen. And that, of course, is a very widely used form of discomfort indeed. So films and TV, of course, routinely employ suspense, the feeling that you know that something is going to happen, but you still have to wait for it to play out. As we start to make interactive experiences, how do those things, how might they come into play? But we can make people discomfortable to entertain them. Second reason for making people uncomfortable might be to enlighten them. So cultural experiences that engage us with challenging or dark and difficult themes, you might want to use a certain amount of discomfort to appropriately frame the engagement, not to trivialise it, for example. The most uncomfortable building I think I've ever been in is the Holocaust Museum in Berlin. That's a building that I believe is deliberately made to frame an uncomfortable engagement with the theme that it's about. The picture that made you groan so much suggests that there is a long tradition of using discomfort in spirituality as part of a road to enlightenment. People fast, they abstain from all sorts of things. Mortification of the flesh, for example, is maybe an extreme form, but there's a very long tradition in people's engagement with the world of experiencing discomfort in order to reach enlightenment. And last up is social bonding. Passing through discomfort is often rites of passage. We recently studied people's souvenir practices at Alton Towers theme park, and we looked at how they documented their day and discussed it. And one of the narratives that emerged, not the only one, but one of them that emerged was the idea of the family rite of passage. We go to Alton Towers every year, and as a junior member of this family, one of the big things you do is you have your first ride on Oblivion, your first ride on Nemesis, and that's the story of the documentation. Jamie's first ride was what it was all about. Quite a lot of studies suggest that one of the reasons, probably not the only one, that teenage boys watch horror films together is it's a shared rite of passage. It's a social bonding activity. So, we're talking at a pretty high level here, but I'm trying to suggest that being uncomfortable is a natural state that we pass through, and it has some benefits in terms of experiences. It can intensify our entertainment, it can frame an enlightening experience, or it might be part of social bonding. So let's just take a look at some examples of what we mean by making people uncomfortable. And there's a number of places we could go. If this was a long talk, I could spend a very long time looking back through the history of art and to some extent entertainment and point out a huge number of examples of deliberately making people uncomfortable as part of a powerful experience. Performance art in particular does a great deal in this area. I'll pick on the odd example, maybe just a couple. Top right, Marina Abramovich's work, really sort of famous from the kind of mid part of the 20th century, mid to latter part. She did all sorts of things. In this particular work, people entering the theatre space had to squeeze through the naked bodies of two performers. Stellark, who's a very well-known artist who's presented at the annual HCI conference, his work before, suspends himself from the ceiling and the audience can cause his body to move and twitch by administering various electric shocks to it and so forth. So there's a very long history at the extreme end of the performing arts of doing this. You'll also find it in more mainstream entertainment. We've already talked about roller coaster and amusement rides, such as the classic Scare 'em ride that you might go on, the ghost train. The item on the right is an $18 electric shock game controller that I bought. So that's a product, it's not some research thing in a lab somewhere, and it's a reaction time game that you play with other people, and basically this thing gives you a belt of juice at the end of it. Not enough to cause any lasting damage, but enough to make you not want to get it and feel pretty tense about your own reaction times in the game. So there are some examples already out there in the entertainment space about deliberately causing pain, for example, as part of an entertaining experience. Sorry about that. So, one of the things that we like to do in our lab is we like to learn by building things. So we thought we would make some experiences. We didn't set out to design discomfort, things happen the other way around. We set out to make some entertainment experiences working with different artists and companies, and what we learnt on the way was that making people uncomfortable is an interesting part of that. So let's just look at a couple of experiences that I'll use to illustrate the talk. So the first collaboration I'm going to talk with is with an artist come designer called Brendan Walker. Brendan's a very interesting character. He trained as an aeronautical engineer. He then went to the Royal College of Art and trained there. And he now works, well, he has his own design company called Ariel. He consults on amusement park rides. He also presents a number of TV series, Channel 4's The House That the 50s Built, for example. With Brendan, we've been exploring the nature of thrill on amusement rides and how we might design more interactive ride experiences. It's been quite a long project, sort of 4 or 5 years so far, and it's passed through lots of stages. The first stage involved capturing people's response close up as they were on a ride. So we hired some rides at the Science Museum and subsequently went to Alton Towers, and we built a personal telemetry system. And this is a system that captures close-up video of your face and your voice, but also your heart rate, your GSR, and other physiological responses as you're on the ride. And it broadcasts it to spectators. So the idea is that other people can tune into your ride experience and get a kind of close-up sense of what you're doing, how your body's responding, which is interesting in itself. But we then got interested in the question as to how could we make the rides more interactive. Now it's not a question that came out of the blue. the next generation of ride technologies looks really interesting. The next generation of ride technologies looks suspiciously like robot arms with people at the end of them that you can put on tracks. There's a ride called the Robo Coaster, I think it's at Legoland, which is, I believe, pretty much exactly a robot arm with 2 seats at the end. Early versions, you could program it to do some movements and then get on and see what they felt like, although I think they might have tuned it down a bit since then. So as an interaction designer, the question is, how would you interact with such a ride? And the approach that we've been exploring is using aspects of your physiological response to control it, to create a kind of human-in-the-loop robotic system. After a number of trial and error early experiments, we've actually hooked on using your breathing to control the ride. So this is our first hacked up example is the Bronchomatic. It's a bucking bronco ride. You can buy these reasonably cheaply that we hacked, and the user's wearing a chest strap which senses their breathing. And it's a pretty simple program. When you sit on the Bronchomatic, the ride gets worse and worse. That's the way bucking broncos always work, of course, you know, because they're trying to throw you off, you're trying to stay on. But in addition to that, when you breathe in, it moves left. When you breathe out, it moves right. So the more you breathe, the harder it is to stay on the ride. This is really interesting. Well, I'll see if maybe I've got a short video example just of it as a demo to give you a sense of it. It'd be a shame not to show it, wouldn't it? Where was it? Oh, that one, wasn't it? So in some ways there's not a lot to see. The interesting thing about the Bronchomatic is it sets up a thrilling tension in the user. You end up battling both the ride and your own bodily response in order to stay on. It depends what your tactics are, but 2 of the common ones are you either try and hold your breath at certain moments to stop it moving. This turns out to be a bad idea because you sit there suddenly realising that you've got to breathe and then realising that when you do breathe it's going to kick off even more than usual. So a tension starts to accrue, quite an uncomfortable one. The other tactic people use is they try and breathe very fast in the early parts of the ride. Or I should have said you score points for the more you breathe as well as the longer you stay on. They try and breathe a lot during the early part of the ride, but then they end up hyperventilating and feel dizzy and then they fall. So either way, it's not a game you can win. But what's interesting and thrilling about it is it's the battle for control. It's your own body that you're trying to control as well as the ride itself. And that's where the entertainment emerges from the Bronchomatic. He wants to learn how to use computers one of these days. So we got interested and thought we'd up the ante a bit. So as we took the Bronchomatic forward to the next prototype, we figured that we would embed a respiration sensor within a rubberized gas mask. So now the user's strapping a rubber mask to their face and breathing in order to control the ride experience. Didn't feel quite safe to put this on a bucking bronco. We thought we'd aim for another sort of ride. And Brendan took his inspiration from Fragonard's painting The Swing, which I reproduce here. It's a really interesting painting, this one, because it depicts an Edwardian, I believe, lady who's enjoying the visceral pleasures of swinging through the air. There's a bit more to it than that. She's being controlled, there's another pleasure, by her husband who's doing the swinging. But there's more to it than that. In the bushes lurks her lover who's looking up her skirts every time she swings past. So there's yet another piece of entertainment within it as well. So we thought we'd essentially reproduce this as an interactive experience. So our ride design is something like the following. You get to play each of those 3 roles as you go through the ride. So when you reach the front of the queue, you're kitted up with your gas mask and you just watch. You're the voyeur for a little while and you see what's going on. After that, you're the rider. Now, when you first start riding, your breathing essentially is what drives the swing. So you're not sort of fighting your own body so much as just seeing how far you'll push the swing to move and rock back and forward as you breathe. And then at some point it's clear that your breathing is no longer controlling the swing and somebody else's is, and that's the controller. And then when you've been the rider, you get to be the controller for the next rider who comes along. So it looks something like this. The prototype wasn't a huge swing, it was big enough, but obviously if you rolled it out at Alton Towers, you'd want a giant swing, it's a huge round ride, but it was big enough. Yeah, here's an example of somebody watching, waiting for somebody else to come and have their turn. So that's one example. The second example I want to draw on to talk about discomfort is quite different. If the stuff I just talked about is very much rooted in the world of mainstream entertainment, then the second example is rooted in the world much more of highbrow performance and art. So this is an artistic work called Ulrika and Eamon Compliant. It's been developed as an interactive experience by a group of artists called Blast Theory, a UK-based group that we worked with over many years. And Ulrika and Eamon is one of the kind of more recent experiences they built. And it's interesting. It's interesting because, it tackles an interesting issue. It tackles the issue of terrorism, and it takes the form of a guided city walk. So you start off at a venue and you take a phone out with you, and you sort of go on a guided tour, and you get a series of pre-recorded voice instructions that are sending you around the city. But as you do the tour, you're also getting fragments of the life story of one of two terrorists, depending on who you choose. It's either Ulrika Meinhof or it's Eamon Collins, the latter from the IRA. You choose which you want to follow, and you get their life story. As the experience unfolds, the instructions you're getting ask you to become more and more compliant. So you're asked to perform certain gestures in public. You're given a very strong sense that you're being watched all of the time. At several points you're asked if you want to stop and really go on with this. The experience also begins to talk to you a bit more as if you were Ulrika or Eamon in some way. So it kind of blurs the kind of your sense of role. Finally, you get to meet an actor or actress who takes you into a room, and there you're politely and nicely interrogated, and you're asked about your views about terrorism, and you're essentially asked what would you fight to defend, and would you ever kill anyone, and you're kind of brought to a confrontation with the material that you've been listening to all the way around. I've some video of this. The video is an artistic documentation of the work, so it doesn't really set out to explain it, it sets out to give you an impression of it. I would say as well, I hope nobody's offended by bad language. I may skip over that bit if I can ever find it, but it contains, as the material would, appropriate to the material, some quite strong language. We won't watch the whole video, it's quite long, but just to get a kind of flavour of what the work's about. Possibly.
Hello, it's me. You and I are going on a walk together.
Hello.
Outside, it's 1973.
I'd like to be Eamon.
Hello, Eamon. I'll stay on the line while you walk. Keep your eyes open. Act natural. There's always a first time for this kind of thing, and practice makes it easier. I'm going to count to 10. If you're still on the line when I get to 10, then I'll know where you stand. 1. The two killers ride into Warren Point on a motorbike. 2. They switch the engine off, allowing the bike to glide the last 20 meters so as not to raise the alarm. 3. Once inside, Iceman goes down the corridor into Toombs' office. 4. He takes...
Oh! Bless YouTube. All we need is an advert now and we're sorted. Okay.
You might just need to refresh the...
Yeah. Well, that might be enough to give you a taster of the work, and I can point you to where the videos are later online. You can watch at your leisure. You maybe at least get a sense of that already, the nature of the material you're being asked to engage with, the nature of the voice that's communicating with you. So, I've spent a fair bit of time on the backstory, I guess, just talking through some examples drawn from our own work. So I guess it's now time for the dangerous bit of the talk, where I give you a cookbook on how to go and make people feel bad. That's not a very good thing of me to do, is it? But there we go. So, first of all, In looking across our own work, reflecting on this, looking at many examples, we see 4 primary forms of discomfort that are relevant, we think, to interaction design. There are lots of ways of making people uncomfortable, but as an interaction designer, how might you go about this? And we looked at 4 different overlapping forms, and have come up with some general tactics that you might use. The first is to make your interaction devices, the equivalent of your mice and your keyboards, out of nasty stuff. So the rubberized gas mask is a good example of a visceral, so by visceral discomfort we're focusing very much on the physical sensation tactics of a visceral device. It's hot, it's sweaty, it smells bad, and it makes you feel quite uncomfortable, it obscures your vision. So implicitly as an interaction device it's uncomfortable. There are other examples of odd things out there too. One of the favourites I came across in the literature was the meat book, which is a tangible interface made out of raw and fairly rancid but looked meat that you have to manipulate to control digital media. Second tactic is to encourage strenuous physicality. So that's what roller coaster rides do to you. So there are actually quite a few examples bubbling up in interaction design that adopt this tactic. There's a whole programme of work emerging in exertion games, which are about games that involve really quite intense physical activity. One of my students pushed the boundary a bit more by coming up with an experience where you listen to a punk poem that gets increasingly frantic through your headphones, but in order to hear it you have to run increasingly fast, and he sets the limit so that you essentially run yourself to a frenzy. You know the kind of running you did as a kid once, where you just ran downhill to see what it was like? Well, it kind of tries to get people to do that again. And the third tactic here is to cause people pain, and that's the electric shock game controller. There are some other interactive artworks that involve holding your hands on surfaces that get hot in order to keep engaging with media. Be careful with that one. It tends to be better to cause people acute pain, and by that I don't mean strong, I mean pain that's transitory, that goes away quickly, rather than pain that sticks around, and also you actually don't want to damage people, so be careful. There are, of course, cultural dimensions to the discomfort that you can cause people. So confronting challenging themes, but getting people to make difficult decisions. That's the interactive part. So lots of media, TV and film, deal with challenging themes. The thing that interactive media does is it gets you to decide what to do. That's what computer games get you to do. Okay, most of the time the decision feels simple. I'll keep shooting and killing to get as many points as I can. But Ulrika and Eamon takes a subtly different take. It asks you to make some kind of a decision. Suddenly brings you to a point where it says, I've given you this stuff, now I'm going to ask you to take a position on it. Do you really want to go on? Do you want to? Which side do you want to take? The other thing culturally is to design resonant devices. What does that mean? The gas mask isn't just uncomfortable. The gas mask has got strong cultural connotations for people. If you've been through the war, or if you've been bombed or been in the middle of a riot as a security operative, gas mask will mean something to you. A gas mask deployed in a museum will raise certain connotations. A gas mask displayed in a fetish nightclub will raise quite other ones. So of course there are inferences people are going to make from that device that themselves are a bit uncomfortable. Those first two forms of discomfort, visceral and cultural, are quite general, and although they're relevant to interaction design, they're perhaps not bang on the money. The next two that I'm going to talk about are absolutely in the territory of interaction design. They are your core business. The first one is control, and that's what interaction design is all about, isn't it? How we control machines. And there are some very well-established principles. Ben Schneiderman, one of his 8 golden rules, the locus of control shall remain with the user. Try and keep the user in control as much as possible. That's a really good principle. So if you start to distort it, you're going to make people feel uncomfortable. So one obvious way of distorting it is to surrender control to the machine. Give up control, be controlled. And that's what a roller coaster is about. It's not always interactive, but you get on a coaster and for the next 2 minutes you are not in control and the machine is in control, and that's why it feels thrilling, or one of the reasons. Surrendering control to other people. So that's what's going on both in Breathless, when you're controlled by someone else, but very much in Blast Theory's work as well. It's about giving up control to the performers, and that's what you have to do to see the journey that they've designed through. And there's also discomfort to be had in taking greater control over things than you might normally expect to get, in controlling other people's experience. That's not always comfortable. And the last one is intimacy. And that's also an interaction design issue, because a lot of interaction design at the moment is about sociality. We're using computers to connect people in new ways all of the time. And pretty much any experience we design now has to think about how is it shared, how is it multi-user, what do people do. So again, if you start to distort in various subtle ways the sociality of an experience, you pretty easily make people uncomfortable. Isolating people is a really important tactic if you want to engage them with your material, of course, and if you want to cut them off from the otherwise familiar support of friends and family, put them on their own. That's what Ulrika and Eamon does, is it sends you out into the city. You are on your own there with just the game. To some extent, that's what the gas mask does as well. It isolates you from the rest of the world, focuses your attention on yourself and your experience, and heightens that sense. Intimacy with strangers is definitely an uncomfortable experience for pretty much all of us. The interview with the final actor, meeting someone and having to deal with them. There again are some unusual artistic works out there, one called Mediated Body, where you have to stroke a performer's clothed, slightly clothed body in order to generate a soundscape. So that becomes about touching someone in order to create sound. And of course, touching someone, a stranger, is not something we on the whole do, or if we do it in quite conscribed ways. Let's put it that way. And finally, surveillance and voyeurism. And these are very much at the heart of a lot of these experiences. So Breathless involves watching other people go through experiences. And Ulrika and Eamon, or when you leave the interview room, and Ulrika and Eamon, as you walk around the back, you realise there's a one-way mirror, and you get to look through that for just a couple of minutes at the next person being interviewed before the artist leads you on, making you feel a bit guilty about the fact that you've been doing it. So, rather dangerously, I've tried to suggest there's a whole bunch of ways that you can make people feel uncomfortable, and some of those are very closely related to interaction design, because they're about control and sociality and how you redesign the way those things work. So let's get to the but part of the talk. Let's be a bit cautious here. You could hear everything I've said so far, being slightly quirky, possibly even occasionally funny, as being just sending you out to make people feel bad. But that's actually not the point. Go back to the beginning. Discomfort is not your end goal in these experiences. Your end goal is to entertain or enlighten or socially bond people. Discomfort is something that's part of the user journey, something that people pass through on the route. So you have to embed discomfort within some broader trajectory of experience. So that's the first point to understand, and there are probably several key things about doing it. So here I've cheekily reproduced, I think it's Freytag's 5-act pyramid of dramatic performance. Dramatic performances consist of exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and dénouement. They don't all, but classic ones do. And you can think about this as a way of designing these moments of discomfort. So exposition is about framing the experience. How do people know what they're going to get? Or at least how can they make a judgment as to the likely severity of it? Rating systems, branding, marketing, advertising, and all of those things are key to giving people a sporting chance of deciding whether they want to do it in the first place. Rising action, anticipation is absolutely key. The suspenseful part of discomfort before you do anything physical to people, and that can be quite long and drawn out. I would suggest that the climax, the moment of creating a more intense discomfort, that's something you might want to keep quite brief. Discomfort that lasts for a long time generally is a bad thing to design. I can't imagine, maybe somebody will give me an example of where it's the case, but I can't imagine that anyone at Disney or Merlin has ever seriously thought about building a roller coaster that makes you nauseous deliberately. That's a form of discomfort that sticks around for quite a while, and it's probably not something that's going to get lots of people queuing up to try it out. But I could be wrong. Maybe some people like it. Falling action, there's a cathartic resolution. That's actually where the pleasure comes from. Once you've been through the first drop on the coaster, you're off, and suddenly the movement feels pleasurable and arousing and is not as bad. So that's a kind of key payoff that you get. And finally, dénouement, which really means you need to give people something to be able to reflect on and make sense of what they've been through at the end. That's why souvenirs are so important in a lot of these experiences, so they can talk about it, relive it, or at least have bragging rights. If you don't believe me, then this is Alton Towers vertical drop roller coaster at Oblivion, and I've just mapped out or charted out what it looks like, and if that's not the 5-act structure that Freitag pointed out, then frankly I don't know what is. Okie dokie, we're in interesting territory here, aren't we? How do we set about doing this ethically? What are the ethical challenges of making people uncomfortable as an interaction designer? Good question. Deep water, heading for trouble. Okay, first of all, if you sit back and think about it, you might want to justify a broad approach even. On what basis could it possibly be right to choose to make people uncomfortable? I'm not a philosopher, not a deeply read ethicist, but I think you can kind of take two lines. Dear old Jeremy Bentham, whose stuffed body still resides at University College London, might have said you could argue for a consequentialist position. The ends justify the means. But be careful what the ends are here. The ends, I think, are entertainment, enlightenment, and sociability. And sure, will people coming out of this experience be happy that they have been sufficiently entertained, enlightened, or socially bonded, that they will be happy with the amount of discomfort you put them through? That's one yardstick you could apply. A second, and this is one of course that's used a lot in the artistic world, coming from Immanuel Kant, would essentially be it's the individual's right to choose, to express themselves as an artist or to express themselves by appreciating or undertaking an artistic experience. Well and good, but not very practical. So here are some of the more detailed ethical issues that you're going to want to wrestle with if you do this, whatever broad position you take. Informed consent is a big deal in lots of experiences, including in research and many experiences we undertake. So you need to think about how does being informed and consenting to something work in this kind of entertainment context, for example. People on the whole don't sign up a classic consent form when they undertake an experience, but as I said before, the framing of the experience has to be sufficient to inform them and let them broadly sign up to what they're going to get. The right to withdraw is interesting. If you're a researcher, then that's one of the core things that you have in experiments. People say, can at any point say, I don't like this, I'm out of your experiment, can my data, let's forget it, and you go, that's of course fine. So, as I said before, what's the right to withdraw in the middle of a roller coaster ride? It's pretty much non-existent. Having studied some roller coaster rides, we observed ride operators. We noticed there were, on occasions, times when people were clearly very scared on rides and wanted to get off. There were probably occasions when the ride operators had noticed that. Maybe not, it's a bit hard to tell. But what's for sure is they didn't stop the ride. Probably a sensible choice. Getting someone off of a ride probably takes as long as continuing with the ride, and it's not clear if at the end of it how they're going to feel on balance about half an hour later about having had the ride stopped and everyone getting off the ride versus if they just live through the next minute and come out the end. So the right to withdraw from these experiences is a tricky issue. Yeah? Again, I'm not saying, don't hear me wrong, that you shouldn't let people withdraw. I'm just saying you're going to have to think about what it means. Privacy and anonymity. What does that mean when I'm deliberately saying to you voyeurism is an exciting thing to be using? I think one of the key things, possibly a key principle here, is that I think there's a big difference between letting someone be a voyeur who has been through or is going to go through the same experience and indeed be watched doing it versus sticking it out to some very general audience. So that's just a personal opinion, but I think there's a big difference between sticking those things out on the internet and letting anyone see them versus letting the next rider see them. There's a kind of symmetry about what's going on that I think might be quite important there. And finally, managing risk. But what I would say here is that the industries that we've looked at or work with are, of course, extremely good at this. People who build roller coasters and theme parks are aware of risk and put a huge amount of effort. So I'm out of time. In fact, I'm over, and you've been very polite not to stop me up to now. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to take any questions and debate afterwards. Thank you.
Any questions for Steve?
Yeah.
Down here?
Just regarding the first one, it was really good. It was an eye-opener. As a designer, to design an interaction for an app, I normally would use a persona to understand the mental model of the user. And use that mental model of the user to design my interaction. Whereas this is actually not using the personas because it's kind of challenging my mental model and psychology of the human thinking. And taking me to a journey that I wouldn't necessarily expect. So I just wanted to know an example of how that can be put into practice in actually the web and digital world. Because I can see it being in the physical one, which is writers and even games, but if I'm designing an application, how can I put some discomfort which the user isn't expecting because the way their psychology is going against us?
Okay, so I haven't tried to do this. I have no idea whether it would work. But so what are some of the principles? You're watching some thrilling material on the web, whatever form that takes. You could tip the balance of control. So at the start of the experience, you're controlling it, you're able to switch it off, stop it, pause it, do whatever, but as the experience goes on, you're not quite able to do that in the same way. It doesn't respond. It seems to have a bit of a life of its own for a while. That would be interesting. You're watching some thrilling material on the web and you think you're on your own doing it, but suddenly you're not quite so sure you're on your own doing it. That's a principle of voyeurism. I'm not saying that these are things you should do, but that's how that kind of thinking might think, now, where does the thrill of engaging with a website, how might I up the ante with my users? Of course, embedded into a trajectory that resolves that, done in an ethical way that doesn't mean that someone's mother rushes in the room and says, "What the hell are you watching right now?" But that's one way you might go about it, or two ways.
Down the back in the check shirt.
Yeah, have you got any nice examples of where discomfort is used on web or in digital products? I don't, offhand, I don't think I have, and I would love to collect some. I mean, there are many, oh, fantastic, please.
I know, down there in the picture.
Chat roulette, yes. Thank you very much. What a lovely example. Chat roulette. Distorting social relationships.
I work for a gambling company in Benford, and we run a gambling exchange, and there's so much of it's in what we do. As in, you can be playing for large sums of money, but we've got a functionality called cash out. So say your team's losing that you put the bet on, you can take your money out at a certain point rather than go through the whole game and lose it all. So that's got that, managing risk and all those aspects you're talking. And so I find really fascinating parallels with that, actually.
Great. Thank you.
I think UKTV did a few apps around the TV show Most Haunted.
Oh, Most Haunted.
Yes, yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. That's great answers to the question. I shall write them all.
Any other questions? No? Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Steve.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.